The danger here is in thinking about Africa simply in terms of either this terrorist threat or also another thing that people talk about is that, well, if we don't do something, then the Russians are going to move in, or if we don't do something, then the Chinese are going to move in. With regard to the Chinese, that boat has already sailed. But the worst possible thing to do is to engage in any of these countries, to get involved in any of these things for the sake of fending off the Russians, for the sake of fending off the Chinese, or for the sake of some concern that they're going to, people in Mali are going to organize terrorist attacks in New York City.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Hope you're ready for another episode of Change Agents, an Ironclad original presented by Firecracker Farm. Now, let's dive in. How does one become a political analyst at the CIA? How does this pipeline work?
It's actually really funny how that worked. I mean, like everybody else, I applied on the website, which got me nowhere, probably like anybody else. But it was until
www.caa.com or probably
yes, or .gov or whatever it was.
Oh, it is probably .gov.
This was 2003, 2004, and it got me nowhere. And then I met a guy who went out with him for lunch, and he says, well, what do you want to do? Because I was a university professor at the time, and I wanted to get out of academia. And I said, I thought it'd be cool to be a CIA analyst. And he said, I can help you with that, because he was a former NSC guy who knew people. So, but then, and I think this is funny, but this is the funny part. He said that I would probably get an easier time getting a job if I said I wanted to work in Africa. And I said, okay, I can do that. Pardon?
What year was that?
2003 or 4. I think he was the one who told me that. It was either that or his CIA friend whom he connected me with. Either he or she then said, like, you should say that you want to work in Africa. And I was game. I mean, my backgrounds actually were European history. Not Africa, although I was interested in Africa, but I thought, yeah, I could do that, and I speak French. So yeah, why not? So I said, sure. And then sure enough, they hired me and put me into the West Africa section. And thus an Africanist was born.
That is interesting because obviously 2002, 2003, people of our age, we understand, 9/11, the impact where the country was oriented. It's interesting that they had already identified a deficiency in Africa. And then correct me if I'm wrong, ISIS, Al-Qaeda came a little bit later, Al-Qaeda first. I don't remember hearing about them moving into the African continent, or maybe I just wasn't paying attention until probably 2010-ish.
Well, okay, so keep in mind, I wasn't brought on to do counterterrorism stuff. I was more a political analyst. So, I'm looking at regime stability and democracy and, rebellions and that kind of thing. Now, that being said, so Al-Qaeda first popped up in northern Mali in around 2003. And it came in the form of an Algerian group called the GSPC, which is an Algerian jihadist group. And so what happened was that because of the global war on terror, the U.S. government started to look into, just started tracking this sort of thing, whereas I bet that they might not have cared previously, but now they care. And everybody was well aware that there are these Algerian crazies now hanging out in the deserts of northern Mali. And they were using it as a safe haven because basically their focus was on making war against jihad, against the Algerian government. They're using the desert of northern Mali as a safe haven, a place to repair, recuperate, and also to generate revenue. They were involved in smuggling. There's a lot of trafficking in the desert, and food, fuel, and also of all things counterfeit cigarettes. That was a big deal. And so they kind of insinuated themselves into that. Also hostage taking, hostage for ransom. Mm-hmm. So what really got them on the radar screens was a situation, I think this is around 2003, where they grabbed a bunch of European tourists and I think in Algeria, I'm sorry, it's been a while, so I don't remember the details, but they then brought them to northern Mali. And now this becomes an international issue. Now, European governments, what the hell? And I think a lot of them are German. So the German intelligence agency was what's going on? Who are these people? And so now they're very definitely on the radar. And now this kind of gets wrapped up into the global war on terror. At the same time, also, the U.S. government stepped up what I believe at the time is called the Trans-Sahel or Trans-Saharan initiative. The name changed like every other year. So there are different iterations: Trans-Sahel Initiative, Trans-Sahel Program, Trans-Sahara. So I don't even know what it's called now, like TSP, TSIP, whatever. So forgive me if I'm getting that wrong. But now there's this whole sort of like initiative, and this means that, among other things, they're dedicating assets to looking at this, and they're also spending money. And as part of the money, now they're interested in training and doing counterterrorism training. So the U.S. government started at around this time frame, 2002, 2003, 2004, working with local intelligence services and working with local militaries, trying to develop what they would call counter-terrorist capabilities. This is a shift because previous to this stage, Pentagon engagement with and Pentagon engagement with the militaries and security services in this area were focused on preparing them for peacekeeping operations abroad. So if you look at the 1990s, for instance, you had Green Berets running around Mali, for example. But the focus is in training, and the focus is ultimately enabling them to participate in peacekeeping operations. And the theme of the day was African solutions, African problems, and thus just trying to help with that. Now the focus shifts to counterterrorism. So it's really around that time frame that people are now paying attention to that, even if this wasn't well known sort of to the general public. But people who watch this part of the world are now thinking about the GSPC and what's going on. So it was, back in those days, it was about the GSPC and what does this mean, and what are the relations with the Malians, and what should the Malians do about it, and what should the U.S. government do to help the Malians deal with the GSPC, et cetera.
Wow. What did a day in the life look like as a political analyst at the agency?
Well, first thing I want to stress that if you want to get a sense of life in the agency, forget about Jack Ryan.
How dare you, sir? That is a documentary.
But wait for this. Watch Office Space.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah. I mean, because it's ultimately, a bunch of 20-somethings and early 30-somethings. I was an early 30-something at the time, in a cubicle. We're in a warren of cubicles, and we all have our Dell workstations, and we have these morning meetings, and, there's like a coffee machine. Somebody brings in donuts, or, maybe somebody goes to Panera and brings in some so-called bagels. And so the day in the life is basically we show up in the morning and fairly early, by 8 a.m. and you log on, you spend like a half hour, an hour reading traffic, like whatever came in overnight, just trying to catch up on the traffic. And the traffic could be everything from open sources, what's in the media, to State Department cables, to communications from the CIA or NSA or just whatever it might be. And then after that, then there's a morning meeting where everybody gathers in a room and kind of goes around and saying, hey, what's going on? And this is the opportunity to sort of flag development and say, there's something I saw this morning that is concerning, or this came in overnight, or so then there's a conversation. And then you go back to your desk. And then what you do for the rest of your day, besides thinking about when you're going to have your lunch break, is usually writing reports. And then the reports would then vary between what they call current intelligence, which is like something's happening and this is what's going on. And then you write that up and you send it out. And that's like a quick turnaround. And it can even be an emergency. So sometimes it's like high pressure. You got to get this done right now. And then we had longer reporting, which at the time was called serial flyers. They changed the names like every other year. So yeah, I have no idea what it's called now. I left in 2009. So a lot of this, I think the day in the life is the same, just that the names for things has changed. Yep. So these are sort of longer papers, longer meaning like 5-page papers. And the deadlines for those, it just depends on what you're working on. And then it's about production. And then maybe at a given time, you might have to give a briefing to somebody. Maybe you have to take the shuttle downtown to go to the State Department or the NSC or the Pentagon to give a briefing there, to meet with your colleagues there. But most of the time, everybody's just kind of sitting in their beehive, right, in their little cubicle and doing their thing.
And then every once in a while, the boss comes and hand selects you and you go execute tactical missions all throughout the world, right?
Yes. Assassinate people and prepare the poison cigars.
Okay, so we're right back on Jack Ryan. Perfect.
We're right back in Jack Ryan. Yes, yes, absolutely. Now, also, it should be said that the way things work at the CIA is that things are really, it's called compartmentalize. And basically what it means is that while I'm an analyst and I might be working on country, whatever, like Mali, that doesn't necessarily mean that I have any idea what the CIA might be doing, if the CIA is doing any kind of covert ops. Like if it is, I have no idea. And only every once in a while would I bump into something and sort of go, oh, right. But by and large, I'm not involved and I don't know. I mean, there used to be like almost physical barriers where the analysts and the ops people were in completely different wings of the building and they didn't even get to share the same cafeteria. There's like a divider in the cafeteria. That's gone. And also when I was in the West Africa office was also mixed. So we had ops people and analysts working in the same office space, but that at the time was highly unusual. In fact, it was an experiment that they started in the 1990s and had forgotten about. So it kept doing its thing while the rest of the agency sort of remained divided. So I had nothing to do with whatever the agency may or may not have been doing in that part of the world. I tend to think that the agency wasn't doing a lot in that part of the world because it was never really a priority. This also means that if you're an analyst working on a non-priority place, we were called global coverage. So basically there are countries that the agency cared a lot about, depending on what the NSC said we needed to care about. So that might have been China, North Korea, Russia, Iran, the obvious choices, but then there's like the rest of the world. So Africa was definitely rest of the world. So for example, I as a Africa analyst was responsible for tracking many countries. Whereas if I were a China analyst, there would have been rooms full of us. And I remember speaking to a guy who'd been a China analyst in the 1980s. And he told me that his single thing that he tracked was transistor production. Like that was it. Wow. So like that pie was sliced very, very finely. Whereas Africa was much more, I kind of did a little bit of everything. So again, like, there's no Jack Ryan. I mean, I did get to go a bunch of times, but mostly when I went to Africa, right, I wasn't doing anything Jack Ryan-esque. It was just the embassy arranges meetings, so I get to talk with politicians or labor leaders or just whatever. And there, it's not like I'm not collecting intel. I'm just like talking to people just to learn, right? It's just I'm on receiving mode just to get a sense of what are people saying. And I travel around. It's sort of like play tourist for what they call like area familiarization. So maybe all sorts of covert things were going on, but I have no idea. I really don't know.
What worked into your decision matrix to finally leave in 2009?
So I left for a bunch of reasons. One is that I was sort of an oddball in the CIA and that I was a bit older than most of my cohort. There had been a huge hiring boom as a result of the global war on terror. And so the number of personnel at the agency blew up. And so I was part of the hiring boom, but this has also meant that I was hired along with all of these like young 20-somethings. I was in my 30s, I had a PhD, I had used to be a professor. And so, but what I found was that what I did basically is a career move. I basically assessed that the things that I brought to the table, regrettably, weren't as valued as I thought that they should have been. Whereas the things that these youngins brought to the table was actually more valued, and meaning like they could crank stuff out faster, they could work longer hours. And because I have an academic predilection, I'm all about like the deep research. And in a way, that's actually not an asset, the deep research. Like taking the time to really read deeply on a subject is not as valued by the bureaucracy as one might expect. And I think this is just a function of it being a large bureaucracy. So whenever you have a large bureaucracy, there has to be performance metrics, performance evaluation, and ultimately it almost boils down to things you can count. And it's just, I think it's inevitable. It comes from the agency just being as large as it was. And maybe if it was just like a little boutique thing, right, like which is what exists in some countries, then maybe that wouldn't be the case. So to me, it's just understandable. So anyways, I left the agency and I went to the RAND Corporation. In the RAND Corporation, I was surrounded by PhDs. And I just sort of felt like here's a place where I kind of belonged more, right? So people understood where I was coming at. And there's sometimes at the agency where something would come out of my mouth and they would pat me on the head and they'd say, "Oh, isn't that cute? Michael used to be a professor." and I often thought that what I was doing was giving superficial answers to the wrong questions. And I didn't feel this when I was in Africa. And in part, it helped that the people who do Africa stuff at the agency, and generally speaking in the US government, are really interested in Africa. These are Africanists. But at some point in my roughly 5 years at the agency, I left to work on Afghanistan. And there the stakes were higher. And so it became more painful for me to see that the administration, I worked first for George W. Bush and then for Obama, I thought they're often asking the wrong questions. And because I had like a front row seat at policymaking, just as a spectator, really, it just became kind of more painful to watch. Whereas Africa didn't really matter. And it was really fascinating to go from working in Africa to working on Afghanistan, and that the amount of supervision and political interest, and Afghanistan was a priority, Africa is not. So it's almost like a completely different environment and a different experience. So that's part of why I left. I thought that I would just be better off at RAND, where I could write 200-page studies, and people really respected the depth as well as the just kind of cranking out and hitting my performance marks.
Ladies and gentlemen, hot salt from Firecracker Farm is the real deal. It's not just heat, it's flavor that elevates everything that you cook. The best thing to happen to food since fire. That's a bold statement, but I'm going to go ahead and agree with that. It's delightful. One of the best things about this brand is there's a real person behind it. His name is Alex, and he makes these in small batches, so it's not always easy to get. You don't want to miss out. All of the flavors are great. I have tried all of them. You really can't go wrong. Seriously, try it on everything. Steaks, vegetables, everything in between. I love cooking. I like cooking at home. I don't like putting sauces and overbearing things on the things that I cook, so I tried a little bit of the salt. And if I'm being honest, I tried a little bit too much the first time. It was a little spicy. So I had to back it off a little bit, and it made everything that I cook at home taste better. So it's an easy addition to the things that I already make. It tasted amazing. I was using the product for well over 6 months before Alex reached out to present as the sponsor for Change Agents. Easy peasy. I was already doing it, no additional time, a touch point with it in my personal life. I can talk about it from personal experience. Love what the brand stands for. Love what the brand was founded around. Enjoy the person who founded the brand. I mean, this is a match made in heaven. Get out of the comfort zone of what you can get in the grocery store. Go online to Firecracker Farm and use the code Ironclad for 15% off of your first order. You're going to be shocked at how much more of a flavor it brings out in what you cook. It's interesting, that hyper focus on Afghanistan and Iraq, and perhaps less of a focus on Africa. The Sahel now is considered to be one of the world's most active fronts when it comes to jihadist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, which probably, in my opinion, has something to do with our tactical success in those other countries and just pushing them outward. I'm just curious, can you bring us up to modern day, how, not necessarily, it doesn't have to be Al-Qaeda or just necessarily ISIS, but jihadist groups, how have they been able to grow to where they are at in the Sahel? Can you just bring us through the evolution of maybe from when you left the agency to where they are now, that time period?
Yeah, so absolutely. So what happened was that so remember, it starts off as a bunch of Algerian lunatics in the desert. And then what happened is that they managed to insinuate themselves in the local community, like they literally married into the local community. And whereas before whatever was going in Mali was irrelevant to them because they're focused on jihad against the Algerian state, at some point they get much more involved in local issues. And then at some point, I wish I remember the chronology, it's been too long, but they rebranded themselves as Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. And this is when the real connection with Al-Qaeda came into play. And along with that, they were broadening their recruitment base, and they were no longer bunch of Algerian crazies in the desert. Now it's like a much more indigenous. And then they began to shift their focus to sort of the jihad against the broader area. Some of why they did this apparently is because they were really getting the crap beaten out of them in Algeria. Like the Algerian security forces were basically winning the war in Algeria. So they were really sort of dangling by a thread. And this is in a way kind of like a desperate way for them to keep themselves in business by doing a rebrand. It's like any corporation, doing a rebrand, but then you're also just shifting, forget about the jihad against Algeria. We kind of lost that war. So now what we're going to do is we're going to do this broader thing. And then so they benefited from being up in northern Mali because there's a very complex political situation there where you've got a lot of Arab and Tuareg and some other groups that have been trying to sort of periodically rebelling against the Malian state. And the Malian state by this time had preferred to deal with this by not dealing with it, and also kind of being afraid to go into it. So like the US would have wanted the Malian government to go in and really just deal with these guys, but they really didn't want to and didn't think they needed to, because it was such an isolated problem that like it didn't affect Mali. So who cares? If they want to hang out all the way, do their thing in the desert, that's fine. And it was not until at some point, I think it was around 2009, that and there was a clear sort of non-aggression pact between the Malian state and AQIM.
Huh.
And then at some point, AQIM turned on the Malian state, and they actually killed a Malian, I think he was a colonel. And then things really kind of went downhill from there. But all the while, the Malian government had the problem that for these political reasons, it was afraid to go up into the north in any kind of assertive way, because anytime they did that, they would infuriate the local hotheads, the Arab and Tuareg non-jihadi people. And also the balance of power was such that the ability of the Malian security forces to actually go up there and operate up there was really very limited. And so it remained kind of a hands-off area, despite the fact that the US and France were kind of, coaxing them and urging them and trying to work with them. And what both the US and France did was focus on training up counterterrorism companies, these company-sized elements to do this job. Nobody wanted the Malian government to actually be strong, because they would use the strength to go and make war on their northern neighbors. Mm-hmm. And for a variety of very sound reasons, nobody wanted, neither us nor the French wanted to get involved in that, right? The message had always been, the mantra I heard when I was in the agency was counter-terrorism, not counter-Tuareg, meaning we want the Malians to fight the terrorists. We don't want them to fight the Tuaregs or to pick a fight with the Tuaregs. We want them to work their issues out with the Tuaregs and the other people up there through normal political processes, and democracy and all that kind of thing. And we really were afraid of enabling them to go and do that. And I think this is very sound. It had some problems, though, which are easy to point out in retrospect, was that it turns out that taking a military and just taking like one company-sized element and making them a bunch of kick-ass ninjas, however ninja-like they might be, however good they might be, and these could be like Navy SEAL caliber, but it actually doesn't help, because a company is just not enough. For one thing, you've got to supply them, sustain them. You need the logistics. You also need to be able to lead them and reinforce them. It's just not enough. You need a full brigade, right, to be of any use. And even the world's best, and they were not Navy SEAL caliber, just put it out there, but they were competent. But a single competent company is just not going to cut it. And so ultimately, AQIM is able to insinuate itself much more and to take advantage of local grievances. And this is really something that they're masters at. They kind of look around and like, what are people pissed off about? And how do we take advantage of this disaffection? And the disaffection is complicated. There are people who are disaffected because of sometimes it's ideological reasons, like some of the people who joined AQIM are like legitimate jihadis who really believe in this stuff. But sometimes it's just about like, I'm a 18-year-old, 19-year-old man who I've got like no economic prospects. I want to advance socially. What is there for me to do? And remember, this is like the poorest part of the poorest country in the world. I mean, this is like, what are you going to do? And joining an armed group actually pays. And it's a great way to get sort of social capital and even make some money. And so a lot of people are involved in that. And a lot of people are often, it's for very parochial reasons, like people in this community feel like they're put upon either by the state or by this other community. And so this is a way to sort of turn the tables. It's all about like local politics, local calculus, individual calculus, et cetera. But either way, AQIM was really good at taking all of this and encouraging people and rallying people, whatever their motives, behind this black flag of jihad. And so over time, it grew, and it really kind of grew faster than the Malian military was capable of responding to. Now, all that being said, the thing that really set everything off is that in 2012, some some Tuareg and Arab groups rebelled. There was a rebellion by non-jihadi Tuareg group that, I mean, there are Arabs involved in whatnot, and they rebelled. This is 2012, and they quickly pushed out the Malian government forces from the north, and also the Islamic groups, which had now also at some point spread, some point meaning like 2010, 2011. It's not just AQIM. There's also this new group called, it was referred to as Mujao because of their acronym, the Arabic acronym. Do not ask me what the acronym is. For literally every time I would write this in a paper, I would have to Google it, go to Wikipedia, and like cut and paste the name. There's AQIM, there's Mujao, and then there was a predominantly, Mujao was like Arab and Songhai, which is this other ethnic group that's up there. AQIM was predominantly Arab, but also with some Tuareg and some Songhai. And then there's Ansar Dine, which started up around this time and was a predominantly Tuareg thing. And they tended to have different regional strengths and tended to recruit more from different classes of people. And they hijacked the Tuareg rebellion of 2012 and just kind of jumped on it, joined it, greatly increased its power, while also literally pushing out the Tuareg group that had started the whole thing.
Damn.
And like kind of kicking them out of the country. And to make matters worse, while all of this is going on, there's a Malian army captain, this I'm told he was like a drunk. This drunk Malian captain decided to have a coup. And partly because he's an idiot, partly I think, people say he was drunk, but also because I think that the Malian army is having a hard time, like morale's really low because they're getting their asses kicked. And also like just fighting up in the north is really super hard and really very unpleasant, particularly when you don't have like serious logistical capabilities. So it sucks. It's like, it's like 110 degrees in the shade. You need supplies, you need water, you need all sorts of things, and they're really struggling. And so there's a lot of discontent, and I think that part of the rebellion had something to do with that. Anyways, he knocks out the government and has a coup against the elected president, and the net effect is just to really weaken the Malian government's ability to deal with any of these things. Like, it's already having a very difficult time. It's already losing the war. And now you've got this coup, which makes it all worse. Plus, because of the coup, the U.S. sort of like freezes help. It's like, we're not going to help with this. I don't know what the French did, but they're not happy. And so this really speaks to what's like, it's like a perfect storm. So by the end of 2012, roughly the whole northern half of Mali is in the hands of the jihadists. And there's like, it's like a phony war like that there was between France and Germany in like between 1939 and the invasion of France in 1940. So there's this phony war with like a DMZ, and the jihadists are up there and the Malian states down below. And that existed up until January 11, roughly, of 2013, when the jihadists attacked and they made a run into the south. And a lot of people were afraid that they're gunning for Bamako, the capital of Mali. And that's when, within 24 hours, the French decided enough is enough. And then they intervened after saying for a long time that they wouldn't actually do this. So the French intervened in a very, very big way. And this ends up being a brigade-sized intervention called Operation Serval. And what they do is they manage to stop the advance of the jihadists and then push the jihadists out of Mali altogether. They kill a bunch of them. They push a whole bunch of them out. Fine. So far, so good. The problem then happens that the jihadists who weren't killed, who just went to ground, are still there. And the French force is never large enough. I mean, this is part of the problem with counterinsurgency or anything like that. It's just like a brigade's worth of people can do nothing more than whack-a-mole.
Yep.
And it's hard for people to grasp this, but Mali is gigantic. Northern Mali itself is like the size of Texas. And there are no roads, like paved roads or anything like that. There's no infrastructure. So like you need like off-road vehicles, you need helicopters. You're playing whack-a-mole. So the French are now involved in this sort of whack-a-mole thing while desperately trying to sort of get the Malian military into some kind of shape, but that's really hard to do for all sorts of reasons. And plus the Americans are like, what do we do? There's a coup, we don't know. And the Americans content themselves to help the French. So that's sort of the extent of American involvement at this point. We're really just helping the French through logistics and intelligence. So in this situation, now you have this classic situation where a very kinetic fire and maneuver kind of French offensive, 2013 Operation Serval, now changes into a static counterinsurgency kind of campaign, which was baptized, that the French called it Operation Barkhane. And now they're really struggling just because of the scale, the size, the nature of the fight. So all the jihadists who went to ground were able to sort of reassert themselves slowly. And also at some point, I don't actually know when, Islamic State emerged in the, I wish I had a map behind me. I really need to do this thing with like a whiteboard, and then I could kind of, draw. I should do that. Far northeast of Mali, or I should, to make it even more confusing, the southeast corner of northern Mali, that's where Islamic State sort of pops up at some point, and it gets really bad. Now, several things happen at the same time that make this just a whole lot worse. So one of the things is that whereas everything I've discussed before has really been about northern Mali, I mean, northern Mali, it's the size of Texas. It's got like a negative population density. I mean, in the sense that there's only like, I don't remember the numbers, but it's like 600,000 people live up there in a place the size of Texas. So heretofore, you could argue that it doesn't really matter if terrorists are running around northern Mali, because who the hell cares? And from the Malian state's perspective, it all really doesn't matter, because the vast majority of Malians don't live there. They live in southern Mali. The vast majority of like the Malian economy, the agriculture, the industrial mines, everything is in the south. It's not in the north. So losing the north, while it's very, it freaks the Malians out from a nationalist point of view. They don't like the idea of secession, because to them it's like, this is all part of Mali. But in reality, it doesn't really matter. You can just cut the country in half, and everybody in the south, which is like where 95% of the population lives, is going to be fine. However, what happened in 2012 is that some of the populations, the communities that live in south central Mali or central Mali, there's almost like three bands. There's the northern, the high north, and then there's the river that goes in the middle of it. It's the river that's sort of the Niger River that kind of goes up. They call it the Niger Bend. And the Niger Bend is kind of like the border between north and south. But the Niger Bend zone, they describe it as an inner delta. Because of the Niger and tributaries of the Niger, and because of flooding, there's this whole zone in the middle that's relatively well watered and has a lot of agriculture, but it has its own ecosystem and its own civilization, and different specific groups that live there and specific communities that live there that are distinct from the north and distinct from the south. So point being is that some of the groups in communities in this middle belt, who had not previously been involved in any of the stuff I'm talking about, suddenly get it in their heads to have a jihad. They're like, okay, partly because, look, if you can't beat them, join them, this pays, but also because of ideological reasons and local politics and all these things. There was one particular guy, I believe his name is Kufa, who decided to get into the game, and he raised the black flag, and he started rallying people of his ethnic group in his community, and really just sort of feeding off all of the losers and the disgruntled parts of his community, or that part of central Mali. And it all has to do with local politics and local issues, and having to do with how do you manage the pasture and the water and all this kind of thing. But the result is that the epicenter of jihadism in Mali switches from the high north, where it arguably doesn't really matter, to the center. And now things are really dangerous. Now you've got much more people, much more economic interests. This is much deadlier. This is much more potentially lethal to the Malian state. And this is where the things really get out of hand. And then, as if that's not bad enough, there's a Burkinabe, somebody from Burkina Faso, who is in central Mali, and he joins the jihad, and he moves back to Burkina Faso, and he basically does the same thing. So an offshoot of the central Malian jihadist insurrection now spreads to the far north of Burkina Faso, and Burkina Faso then goes up in flames for a matter of just a few years, and it just becomes a complete disaster in Burkina Faso. I think what we're seeing now, because things have really been getting worse, like Burkina Faso has been falling apart, Niger's in bad shape, Mali's just slowly circling down the drain, is just the impossibility of a small military and security forces to run back and forth, putting their fingers in the cracks in the dike, right, and to cover all this ground, while slowly but surely the insurgency is growing. And I have to say this, one of the reasons why the insurgency is growing is because both the Malians and the Burkinabe have been killing civilians and lashing out. And some of it's, they lash out. A lot of the jihadists in central Mali and in Burkina Faso are ethnic Fulani. And what they've been doing is they've been lashing out against Fulani communities, and the Fulani communities are disproportionately targeted by the security forces. So there have been massacres perpetrated against Fulanis by the security forces. The Russians have been egging them on. And even if the Russians aren't directly involved in the massacres, I think that the presence of the Russians has given like a tacit green light. So one of the things that this has done is this has helped radicalize some of the people in these communities, and also put a lot of people in these communities like the caught between two fires. The jihadists are doing terrible things. The state security services and the Russians are doing terrible things. So what are you going to do? So some are fled, right, to become refugees or IDPs, and some are saying, screw it, let's throw in with the jihadists because they offer safety, relative safety, and because maybe they're the winning side. And I think that's part of the calculus that's going on in a lot of Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali. Meanwhile, the French are out. Burkinabe also had their coup and also ended up kicking the French out. The UN peacekeeping force in Mali has been kicked out. There have been these European Union training missions. They've been kicked out. The Americans have been, ever since all these coups, there were coups in the last these three countries in the last few years, particularly, right, they would freeze the aid, and now like the Trump administration is sort of eyeballing this and thinking, well, maybe we need to find a way to work with these people anyways because everything's going to hell. But there's no real enthusiasm on the part of the US government for doing anything that might possibly make any kind of difference in the battlefield. It's just falling apart. You've got powder kegs in terms of social, economic, and political problems, local politics. You've got very, very, very poor, inadequate governments that do a terrible job of governance. And also, it's axiomatic that in a counterinsurgency situation, that in order to succeed, it's all about the governance piece, and it's all about reforging the social contract with the local communities. These governments have not done this. They've not really tried to do this. I think Niger's government under their former president Bazoum was doing the best job, but he got kicked out by some general for purely personal reasons. And the junta that replaced President Bazoum is just, they're just kind of completely off the rails. And then you've got security services that just lash out blindly and just end up like massacring people. Plus in Mali, they brought in the Russians, and the Russians just made everything worse. So that's why it's falling apart.
From day one, Change Agents has been about one thing: telling the stories of people who risk everything to make a difference.
I was trying to get him to confess to murdering those veterans at the VA hospital.
I guess you got to go all the way up the food chain.
This season, we're raising the stakes. We're going to sit down with men and women who aren't just helping communities, they're stepping into the most dangerous hidden corners of the world. These are the voices most people never hear, operating behind the headline, under fire, and in the dark. I'm Andy Stumpf, and this is Change Agents, an Ironclad original. New episodes are going to drop every Wednesday. You can watch and listen on YouTube at This Is Ironclad and everywhere else that you get your podcasts. So strategically, and I mean, let's be honest, most people in the Western world would probably struggle to find Mali or Niger on the map, or the tri-region area. So strategically, if you were able to, get together a group of world leaders that haven't been paying attention to this, what would you say to them the importance of paying attention to this so that it doesn't spill outside of that tri-region area, the greater strategic impact and effects that it could have globally?
Okay, so this is a really good question. And part of why it's such an awesome question is that it's remarkably difficult to answer. Because the reality is I cannot argue that this needs to be high priority. Like, I cannot go to the president and say, Mr. President, this is a really big deal. Given everything else that's going on in the world, I can't do that. I just can't. Mm-hmm. And this is true for everybody else in the West. I think for Europeans, there are more direct implications because all of this is fueling their immigration problem. So they deal with this immigration issue having to do with like Africans who get in boats and cross the Mediterranean, and right, that's their thing. So they care, if for no other reason they care about that. For the US, it's much less of an issue, right? Our migrants are Latin American much more. They're not like Malian. Okay, so that's one thing. One of the things that I can say has to do with the fact that the fact that the Sahel, that these three countries are really just going to hell in a handbasket. They are dragging down or threaten to drag down the countries that surround them and border them. So this threat is in real danger of metastasizing and dragging them down. So there are, below Burkina Faso are what the Americans refer to as the littoral countries. The French call them the Gulf of Guinea countries. We're talking Ghana, Benin, Ghana, Togo, Cote d'Ivoire. Nigeria, of course, is this whole other mess. But also, from Senegal all the way to Nigeria. Everything that's happening now in Burkina Faso and Mali threatens to drag down all the countries in the region. These countries are all relatively stable. Some of them are actually surprisingly democratic. I mean, Senegal has a remarkably stable democracy. Ghana as well. Togo, not at all. Benin, yeah, kind of. Cote d'Ivoire, yeah, kind of. Let's call them flawed democracies. With economies that are relatively thriving. No, they are thriving, particularly compared to the Sahel. And they have a lot going for them. These are also countries where migrants go through these countries. You've got growing urban cities, like we've been investing a lot. Their business interests, economic interests, USAID has dumped tons of money into these countries. It's like we're investing in these countries. So while I could argue that we don't really care if Mali and Niger and Burkina Faso collapse, right? I think that as it spreads, the stakes get higher, the impact for all of us gets higher. We also have the reality that sub-Saharan Africa's population is going through the roof. Supposedly by 2050, it's going to be, what's the statistic? Like half the world's population or a third or so. I don't remember really? Exactly.
I had not heard that.
I could Google it in 3 seconds. I've written it 1,000 times. I should remember it, but just because I'm an old man. Sub-Saharan Africa's population is growing rapidly while the rest of the world's population is either stable or shrinking. Yeah. And so this has profound ramifications for everybody, but also because you just got a ton of people and a growing number of people. And so ultimately, these problems are going to affect us one way or another. And it's no longer the case that what happens in Africa stays in Africa. Because of the global nature of the world and international travel and migration and terrorism and public health things and pandemics and whatnot, this stuff just gets around really, really quickly. So perhaps the best argument I could make is that sooner or later, all of this is going to really bite us in the butt, right? And in a big way. This is going to hurt us. And the sooner we try to deal with it, the easier it will be. And the danger is that from like a US policy point of view, the US policy making tends to focus on what is the screaming, bleeding, crying emergency of right now, right? And then everything else is economy of force. That's the term I use, that the Pentagon would use. So all economy of force, which I think is a complete misunderstanding of the concept of economy of force, but whatever. So leave it alone. Let's neglect everything that's not an immediate crisis. But what happens then is that we react only when things become a pressing direct crisis, by which time it's too late. Yeah. This is exactly what happened in Burkina Faso, by the way, because things had started to really kick off. Like 2017, it was clear that things were getting bad in Burkina Faso. And the U.S. response was like, oh, it's not a big deal. And the U.S. was doing security assistance to the Burkinabe, but like at a small scale. It was never commensurate with the real need. And I remember meeting with the U.S. ambassador to Burkina Faso and asking about this, like, what are we doing to train up the Burkinabe security forces? And he described to me this really nice thing that was really very small. And I thought, like, are you kidding me? Like, that's it. And what he was describing was a reflection of U.S. priorities, but also of this practice of writing things off as it's not a pressing priority, so we don't have to deal with it. And then you throw around the term like economy of force. So I would say that the sooner we get involved in a constructive way, the better, because this is just going to grow and grow and grow and grow and grow and get a lot worse. And I like the metastasis metaphor of like a cancer. Like, you want to deal with the cancer before it metastasizes. And then once it metastasizes, like, you got to jump on it as soon as possible, because at some point the cancer spreads throughout the body and then it's just, you're done. So as this spreads, it's going to be harder and harder to deal with.
In addition to the spread, would you say there's a parallel between, call it Afghanistan, late 90s, where just a jihadist safe haven? I mean, again, people, the United States specifically, looking through my own optic, I didn't pay attention to Taliban and Al-Qaeda until aircraft flew into buildings and you reverse engineer backwards.
Right.
Would you say that this, in addition to that spread and dragging down the countries around it, could be similar to that environment where jihadists can openly plan, recruit, train, whatever they want to do?
I don't think it's certainly possible, but I think it's too easy to overstate that threat. For one thing, so far the groups that are involved are really focused on local issues and aren't interested in the global jihad. Like, so JNIM, for example, has said very clearly that they have no beef with France. They just want to kick France out, right? Now, at some point, maybe after they've conquered Mali, then maybe they start to get more aggressive and more interested. So I think that maybe kind of in the long term, yes. Although I would say that this threat does happen more when as it starts to affect more the littoral countries and the big cities. So it's a distant threat, which matters if you're trying to prioritize where your threats coming from. But I don't think it's Afghanistan in the 1990s, because you don't, for one thing, the relationship between these groups and, let's say, Al-Qaeda Central, such that still exists, is really very distant and remote. It's more like a franchise, right?
Licensing, perhaps, they have more operating ability than a franchisee, less boundaries.
Right. Right. So, but they're not under direct command and control, and I think that's an important thing. And I don't think it's a question of like Al-Qaeda Central moving its chess pieces across the board in some vast game to destroy the West. I don't think that's happening at all, in part because we've done so much damage to Al-Qaeda Central that even if that mentality or that intent existed, I think it's gone. Like, they don't have that capability.
Yeah,
if it ever
like they're aligning, they're more aligning ideologically, or picking, what would be the best way to describe it? They're picking the uniform that most closely aligns with what they feel attached with. They may not share the overarching goal of, Al-Qaeda, ISIS at the very top. They see a shade of that and they're picking that uniform because it closely enough aligns. But yeah, at the tactical level, they don't have any interest in the strategic goals of ISIS or Al-Qaeda.
I think that's correct. I mean, the real concern is more certainly with ISIS or Islamic State in the Sahel province, or whatever, as there are different names that go about.
Whatever I fill in the blank in the area.
IS something. Yeah. The IS something in the Sahel region is very dangerous in that it's nihilistic, and JNIM also seems to be nihilistic in the sense that they're destroying, they're not building. And I almost look back with nostalgia to when there used to be these like communist rebel groups, insurgents in countries, because the communist rebel groups, for all their flaws, which they had many, at least had this like positive vision of wanting to build a society that would have involved schools and daycare centers and hospitals. They wanted to build rather than to destroy.
Yeah.
Whereas these groups, I look at them like, you guys just want to destroy. There's no positive vision here, because I guess for a jihadist, the perfect society, like, you're basically deferring happiness for the next life rather than this life. So this life is all about being miserable and austere, and that's what's going to buy you happiness in the next life. So they're just sort of destroying, and they're just taking apart what remains of these states. And so they're just eviscerating everybody and just making everybody more poor, and they're just reversing development. The terrorist threat, I think I would want to be careful with that. I think that it's less so. I think that there is this long-term danger. So for instance, there's this danger that as the sort of jihadism also anchors itself more in the populations, let's say in the littoral region, or, like maybe in Senegal and Cote d'Ivoire or whatnot, then you have a problem in Europe. You've got like Senegalese diaspora and Ivoirian diaspora and all these people. Like the greater the diaspora is, then there's also sort of this concern of like the contagion kind of spreading. And sometimes I perceive amongst the French, and I deal a lot with the French military, with the French, like the French think tankers and whatnot. And I often pick up indications that there's this unspoken fear of an Islamist insurgency there. It's not spoken, it's not voiced, but it's like I run into these like hints that like that's like the worst case scenario. It doesn't exist, right? Just to be clear, it's not happening. But the greater these parts of these African populations become infected with this sort of nihilistic jihadism, the greater the risk to Europe itself, and then theoretically also to the United States.
Yeah,
I think that's the kind of danger that you're looking at, but it's like a long-term sort of danger. It's not, what doesn't concern me is what happened in Afghanistan, where people use Afghanistan in order to plot to drive airplanes into cities, into towers in New York City, right, or Paris. I don't see that as the real concern here.
It's fascinating, Mike. I want to be respectful of your time, and I feel like we could talk about this for hours. For people listening to this or watching this, where would you point them just on their journey of educating themselves about the region on their own? Do you have any good portals or avenues that you would start them on?
There's some NGOs and think tanks that have done some really good work here on this. So I think Crisis Group has done really good coverage of the Sahel region. So if you go to the Crisis Group website, you can find some really good reports. Human Rights Watch, although there's much as an organization that they do that I don't like, but their coverage of the Sahel has been very good. So you can find some really good things there. And one of the things that both Crisis Group and the Sahel and Human Rights Watch have done is written a lot about the sort of that local political dynamics and why it is that that's fueling a lot of what's going on. And also sort of talking about the fact that the sort of abuses by the security services are really just exacerbating everything. Beyond that, very little is done, because this is something that only once in a while does it pop up into the media. I mean, like the Washington Post, for instance, just did a piece. If you're, well, I assume your audience is in French reading. I mean, Le Monde has done very good coverage over the years. Washington Post and New York Times have written very good things. So I give them an endorsement for quality, but it's very infrequent. But if you were to look for that stuff, at least like read it knowing that, yeah, this is pretty good material. Beyond that, there's really not much. I mean, there's like a handful of people like me who post about this stuff on Twitter that might be useful. But beyond that, I could recommend some Twitter people that are good to follow. And there's some names of people that I think know their stuff. So when they write about it, like, you can respect them. And I can give you some names. But beyond that, there's really no obvious choice, just because it's written about so infrequently, particularly in the English language. There's better stuff in French media, but not in the English media.
Which will be a stumbling block for most Americans like myself who struggle with English, let alone learning a second language. I'll let you have the last words. What do you want to say to the audience? I'll let you close it out, and any final thoughts you may have.
I think that the danger here is in thinking about Africa simply in terms of either this terrorist threat, or also another thing that people talk about is that, well, if we don't do something, then the Russians are going to move in, or if we don't do something, then the Chinese are going to move in. With regard to the Chinese, that boat has already sailed. Like, they are already the dominant players in pretty much all of sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah.
But that doesn't necessarily have political ramifications, because the Chinese are really focused on economic stuff. The Russians are nefarious actors, but their influence is actually very limited because they have very little money to put on the table. But the worst possible thing to do is to engage in any of these countries, to get involved in any of these things for the sake of fending off the Russians, for the sake of fending off the Chinese, or for the sake of some concern that people in Mali are going to organize terrorist attacks in New York City. I think that one has to think about these countries for their own sake and try to understand them in their own terms, and think about what to do to help them, and also what to do that's constructive in trying to engage with them in productive ways, because I think most of our engagement with them generally has not been productive. So there's a lot of room for fresh thinking about what can we possibly do. And ultimately, the people there matter, and their population there is growing. And I think that kind of approach is going to yield better results than if we were to just exclusively focus on taking out the jihadis or fending off the Russians. I just don't think either of those two things work. Since we're not really prepared to do enough. I mean, taking out the jihadis, like France tried, they sent a whole brigade and the French Air Force, and that didn't work. So we're not going to do that. And we're certainly not going to send even as much as a brigade, whereas you need to send more. So that's not going to happen. Yeah. Whereas also with the economic stuff, we can't even begin to compete with the Chinese. So forget about it. So find other ways. And so that's what I would sort of ask everybody to think about these countries for their own sake, these people for their own sake, and also know that Africa, when I talk about how what happens in Africa doesn't anymore stay in Africa, it's also not just the bad things, it's also really good things, because all these people, they're intelligent, industrious, they're inventing things culturally. We all benefit from, even sort of, as Trump would call, like shitholes, working better and being better, because there are a lot of really good people, a lot of really good talented people who have a lot to offer to everybody.
Hope you enjoyed today's episode. Thanks you again for listening to Change Agents, an Ironclad original presented by Firecracker Farm. I'll see everybody next week with an all-new guest and an all-new topic. See you then.
Was there ever a moment where they tested you with your own hand and saying like, hey, we might need you to do this? And were you questioning like, oh, I got to blow my cover here soon?
Yeah. There was not that type of activity, but other, I'll say, criminal acts that I was asked to partake in. When you're trying to earn respect, right, which is the biggest word in that world, you can't earn it by constantly rolling over and just taking everything from everybody. They'll push until you say no. That's for sure. Because I posed as a money launderer the whole time. I can't say like, I'm a regular Joe. And so I adopted a criminal persona, I would say, on top of the commercial cover. So I intersected with a lot of that world so I could do our operations, which was covert finance. I was moving Uncle Sam's money into places for us to use it. And I pretended that I was a criminal money launderer the whole time to facilitate that.
How did you gain enough trust for them to like, was it like, here's a little bit, let me see what you do with this, and then boom, let's go all in?
So that's a super fine line that you're trying to do when you're dropping the trail of breadcrumbs to get them to it. Because if you do it too much, they're gonna say, well, we don't want to do it with this guy. He's got a big mouth who just talks about stuff all the time, right? This guy's a joker. So you can't like just get drunk and bring it up one night. It has to be really, really planned out. And you just take advantage of the first time something comes up. We knew that one of the adversaries was hiring private investigators to check into people. And they would have like a female call up to a PI where they thought, somebody like I lived, and say, hey, I think, that my fiance's cheating on me. Can you look into this guy? And so it created an unofficial surveillance program against us. And so the idea was, let's take the Bureau's list of organized crime affiliated spots and start hanging out. That way, if the PI says he's going to come back and say, hey, I don't think he's cheating on you, but I do think he's kind of hanging out with some scumbags, and it would reinforce our story that way.
How many layers of cover is that? Like, how deep does that go?
So it is multiple layers of cover. It's kind of like playing four-dimensional chess at times. But the primary one is just the commercial cover that I was given, which I can't say specifically what that job was. And then on top of that, it was, we need to convince everybody that you're a criminal, and that's why you're doing this, not because you work for a government organization and things like that, right? So we're starting with money that's all stamped US dollars, right? If it's allocated to CT budget or whatever, and it needs to be, let's say, laundered, right? If it was illegal, it would be laundering, but distanced from the original source of the US government so that we could buy stuff or pay people or get money into places without the US government's footprint all over it was the goal.
I don't know if I'm allowed to ask this, but like when you start to work with the CIA, like we need you to act as this guy, like they help you with your whole cover and then they tell you this is what we need from you?
The broad mission would be that I would routinely move our finances over to different places. So each individual mission would be, okay, this much money needs to get here to support, you know, let's say hypothetically JSOC stuff in East Africa. You know, we got to get money over there. How it would break apart the missions. But mostly they all bled together because I had to run a network of entities or a network of financial accounts that they could dip into whenever. A lot of the time, what'll happen is they'll inject it into businesses that are owned, and the beneficial owner downstream would be, let's say, like a senior leader in the cartel, right? So if I use a trust in Nevis that owns a bunch of companies all over the world, and those companies pay out to the trust, and the beneficial owner is the cartel leader, then they look like they're making money off legitimate businesses all over the world.